Welcome to those of you at home. Welcome to the enormous turnout that we have here. There's about 30 people in the lounge here.
20 online.
20 online. Wonderful. The only announcement that I have is to remind you that the day before the eclipse, the Sunday, the Murney Tower is offering a children's program. And any of you are welcome to, I guess you're welcome to take your children. But I will say you're welcome to go and at least see what has been happening in the tower. It's just that Sunday, and I think you probably need to book ahead because I suspect there'll be quite a rush there. So if anybody else, either at home or here, has any further announcements, Paul, can you tell me if anybody's waiting?
No, I'm not looking.
All speaking?
Right now.
Okay. And ask people at home, of course, once they've got nothing to say, to go on to mute and hand over to Duncan, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening. I'm Duncan McDowell. I run the program for the Kingston Historical Society, and welcome to our third event of this year. It's my privilege tonight to introduce our speaker, Eric Gagnon, which I'll do in just a second. But by way of background, I'd like to point out that for over 175 years, Kingston has an intimate relationship with trains and railways. In the 1850s, the city struggled to attach itself to the Grand Trunk Railway, that great arterial route that made the spinal cord of the emerging Ontario economy. In the 1870s, Kingston itself tried to sponsor railways into its hinterland. The Kingston and Pembroke Railway, the K&P Railway, was a Kingston innovation. Our MP and Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, was the architect of a coast-to-coast railway, and one can't help but think the seed of that was sown in his early years as an alderman here in Kingston. Along the waterfront, trains brought prosperity. A locomotive company was established here and worked well into the 20th century, building trains and engines for Canada and for export. Our whole waterfront, in fact, is a tribute to the connection that the railway brought to this city, enhancing that the ships had brought before it. Well, today that hum of industry along the waterfront is quite quiet. The railway no longer stops downtown, and many of the industries dependent on it are long gone. The locomotive company, for instance. But we are left in the city with plenty of vestiges of the railway age. Street names: John Counter Boulevard. John Counter was the mayor of Kingston when those first railways came into being in the city. I'm often think when I go to the station here in Kingston that the ticket bureau in the Via station has hanging above it a wonderful old clock from the Grand Trunk Railway, which they preserved and still keeps the time. So we were reminded of the railway everywhere we look in Kingston. And every night as I try to sleep, where we live in Kingston, I hear the hum or the rumble of trains moving along the edge of our city. I'm so good at it now. I know what a freight sounds like, and I know what a passenger train sounds like. So the railways are intimately bound up with our history, and no one knows that better than our speaker tonight, Eric Gagnon. Eric was born in Montreal, but moved to Kingston early and has had trains in his vision ever since. He jokes that as a school kid, he often slipped out of school and what the British call train spotted, watching trains. And I was just saying to Eric, when you're at the Via station, if you look at the very end of the platform, there is a bench for people to sit and watch the trains go by and jot down the numbers of the locos and all that sort of thing. So Eric comes out of this rich culture of trains in Canada. He has also devoted much of his time to researching trains, writing about them, blogging about them, and I believe also singing about them. Move over the Great Canadian Railway Trilogy. His books include a history of Via Rail and 2 books on Kingston's waterfront railway history, Smoke on the Waterfront and Stories on the Waterfront. I believe he's brought some copies of those tonight if you wish to buy one. So tonight he's going to tell us more about his interest in railways in Kingston and will speak on the topic of 2 miles, 2 tracks, 2 railways to obscurity. Eric, welcome, and all aboard everyone else.
Thank you. So thank you. It's great to be here. As you can see, that's the title of my talk, and that's where we live. I don't consider myself a great historical researcher by any means, but when you think of someone doing historical research, what do you think? Do you think Indiana Jones and digging through Egypt and the dust of various past civilizations? Do you think of students who have no choice but to study and try to enjoy it? Do you think of people playing with model trains? Probably you don't. But I am no Sheldon. I try not to be. Sheldon is at the left. I am at the right. So I think the key here is realistic. We're trying to get realistic model railways. And this is my goal in a nutshell. I want to be able to reproduce a car of potatoes from Bath, New Brunswick, sitting at Quattrochi's in April 1979 in HO scale. That's on the right is my version of it. On the left is my one and only time seeing a car downtown on the trackage I'm going to be talking about. So thank you to Duncan and the entire society. It's a great honor for me to be here. As you can see, I am happily retired from healthcare. And as Duncan hinted, I'm also a bit of a photographer, blogger, and I do stand out by the tracks quite a bit. I launched the blog in 2008. Those are my first 6 books. And as Duncan mentioned, I've also done 2 further. So you'll hear me say this phrase a lot, Hanley Spur. What is the Hanley Spur? Well, for my purposes, I'm using it to describe all the waterfront trackage of CN and CP, basically from Division Street, Montreal Street, south to City Hall and just beyond. Technically, the Hanley Spur was a Grand Trunk Railway conception, which later became CN. And as Duncan mentioned, the Kingston Pembroke became CP. But for my purposes, I'm calling it all one thing because most of the time the tracks were parallel. So they're very close to each other. This is my first Hanley Spur experience in 1969, taken by my dad. I'm the saucy little fellow in the Mariner's cap there at the bottom right with my siblings. My brother's also a blogger, I should mention. And my dad was a great documenter of things. So I think we come by it naturally. There I am a year later, standing at what some of you might recognize, although you sure won't recognize it today. This is the outer station on Montreal Street, and that's me. We're waiting for my grandmother to arrive from Dorval. Here she comes on the noontime train. And the interesting thing about this photo, you might look at it as my wife tends to say, oh, it's just a train picture. Well, they're all just train pictures, but what do they tell us? And in this one, what is interesting is at the time I had no idea, but at the right is where the Hanley Spur begins. That humble little gray shed, which was various things over the years, Chown Warehouse is what I think of it as. Between that and that little tool shed is where the Hanley Spur begins. So I had no idea about that at the time. And I should mention, I'm proudly wearing the colors, or at least name badge, of the Associated Railroaders of Kingston, which I think is a group that probably has less structure than your group does. We don't have much structure at all, but we do like trains. And so this sort of thing gets our blood pumping. So which railways operated here? Well, you've seen this building downtown. It's usually some sort of a restaurant. It's what I would call the inner station. And so this was operated by the Grand Trunk Railway and CN until about 1919. The first trains did meet in Kingston, although not at this station, in 1856. But this station was the end of what I'll call the Hanley Spur, which extended 2 miles south from the main line between Montreal and Toronto, and came to be about 1860. It was crossed by the CP later on. I'll talk about that later. There was a causeway across England Bay at one time. They shared another piece of track crossing Ontario Street, which I'll talk about. The initial line was built out for the Market Battery on a bit of an embankment into the water. And as Duncan mentioned, there was a locomotive builder and shipyards at the end of the Hanley Spur. So here we are at the outer station, another classic limestone building that was demolished in '63, which was the engine shed there. And you'll notice in all these pictures that aren't mine, I'll try to put a credit in the brackets at the bottom. So this was from Mike Hamer. His dad took it, and it shows a little tea kettle that you might see running downtown being serviced out there with some coal and water. As some of you may be familiar, the curve that this outer station was on was quite severe. And in 1947, the train tipped right over at speed. And it tipped over such that the water from the tender sloshed into the waiting room of the station and filled it with several inches of water. That would have been a shock. I'm not going to talk about the preservation of the station whatsoever. So the question is, was the Hanley spur built for the locomotive plant? And the indications are that it was, because James Morton here got the contract for it and was late in 1860. Prior to this, even though locomotives were being produced on the waterfront, there wasn't a direct track to the plant. So in some cases, they built a temporary track on Ontario Street and basically rolled the locomotive down there a short ways and then took up the track again. Clearly, that was inefficient. And so the first published date of the spur to the plant was 1864, although some locomotives had been delivered earlier. So this is all that the Hanley spur rated in a CN employees timetable. That was it. 2.2 miles from Kingston, which was the outer station, to Hanley, which was the inner station. The other, I won't say competition, but the other railway was the famous Kingston and Pembroke. Are you allowed to say kick and push to your group, or is that too vernacular? The thing is, all those, anything goes, all those names actually had a lot of meaning to them. Now, it was common for people around those, any line, to give it a nickname. So for instance, British Columbia Railway, that was Bennett's Crazy Railway. PGE was Prince George eventually. The New York, Ontario, and Western, the O&W, was the Old and Weary. So it was common to have these nicknames. So Kick and Bush, I think, has some honor to it, and that pertains to how it operated.
Can I add one more?
Please.
Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo
To hell and back.
to hell and back.
Yeah, is that a good one? There's another one that was the oat, straw, and hay. That was up a little farther north. Yeah. So it was chartered in 1871. This is a nice view of the, I'll say, lake side of the station. As you can see, it was not accessible by today's standards. And even though it was a fledgling railway, the KMP had already carried 36,000 passengers by 1883. And the National Railway was not finished till 1885. So we were well ahead of things here in Kingston. So we were at the southern end of the CP Kingston subdivision, or the KMP. There was a connection at Charlotte Lake, and later another connection which exists today or existed until 86 at Titchburn. But probably the one reason it was called the Kick and Push is because even the most cracked passenger train could only go 30 miles an hour. So did they kick and push it over the line? Maybe they did. This was the first kick. There I go. First KMP station, which was at Place d'Armes. There was a request by the KMP to build on where, I'll say, Fort Frontenac sits. And you'll see, if you can look at the bottom right corner of that picture, a track extending to the Montreal Transportation Company grain elevator was built along with this first station. But that was not the final station. So slightly north of that, they built a small yard on North Street. There was a car shop to repair cars and possibly manufacture them around the Depot School, what is now Railway Street, but it burnt. You all know the Kingston and Pembroke Station across from City Hall, and it had a covered awning to a baggage room, and the nearby freight station was just closer to the water, but all that was taken away except the station when CP relocated to Dalton Avenue. Some fun facts about the KMP. The first car of US coal reached Kingston, but it didn't just come across easily. It had to go across Morristown, New York to Brockville, up to Perth, west to somewhere around Charlotte Lake, and down the KMP to Kingston. Now, I don't imagine they made too much on that trip. And certainly a lot of the early KMP tonnage was lumber as well as minerals. And it is said in 1903, there was hardly a prospector in Ontario who needed to look beyond Frontenac and Hastings counties, but a year later, you couldn't find one. They'd all gone to richer fields. So our amount of resource depth was shallow. And in fact, the freight traffic was generating very little for people in Kingston, but maybe some for the shareholders, and eventually went into CP hands. This is a 1950 employees timetable of the KMP, by then the CP. And I've just, actually my brother scanned this, and I've just clipped it off at Harrowsmith, because that's about as far north as I look. But you can see Kingston would be at City Hall. Then we have the Roundhouse, that would be at North Street. Cataraqui, I believe, was around Sydenham Road. Glenvale, Mervale, Harrowsmith. Harrowsmith was also quite a little railway town. At least there were 2 railways that ran through it. So the railway lines specifically coming into Kingston crossed each other. So first was the Grand Trunk going east and west. Then the Kingston and Pembroke came in going north and south. But there were rudimentary signals, but as the number of trains increased, those signals were not thought to be the most trustworthy way of having 2 trains basically share the same geographical place. So CP built a bridge, or was obligated to build, over the CN in 1922. And that was just east of the current Division Street. In 1974, CN realigned their curve at the old outer station, which I'll show you in a moment. And by doing that, they effectively severed the CP connection into Kingston at that point. So at that point, CP could only come as far as about Division Street, let's say around Counter Street. But CN did eventually serve some of those customers. Both lines downtown died out in about the early 80s, certainly by 1986. So to summarize, the CN Hanley spur was a short spur linked to the main line, which was the busiest intercity line in Canada. An interesting point about it was that for those years indicated, you could board a train at the interstation near City Hall, and in 12 minutes be whisked to the outer station and get off that train and onto another train to go wherever you were going in Canada. And between 1911 and 29, you could bed down in your berth across from City Hall and be whisked, potentially sleeping, to those cities. 1929-30, everything seemed to change because the automobile was on the rise. As I mentioned, the CP Kingston subdivision was intended to be a standalone line, a resource line, but after being leased by CP was a paper railway for 999 years, which didn't come anywhere close to lasting that long, and never reached Pembroke, sadly. So we may as well call it the Kingston and Renfrew, because that's as far as it got. I just wanted to mention a few special trains that have visited our waterfront over the years. The Royal Scot was a British locomotive that came in 33. The American Rexall train was on a barnstorming tour of North America, and it was parked on Ontario Street in 36. The King and Queen came here in 39. The Confederation train visited in 67. The Flying Scotsman, the LNER 4472, was, I think, the last train to really venture down to across from City Hall, 1970. And I know because we were there and I was about that tall, and it was raining, true English weather. And then the Queen again came, the reigning Queen came in 1973, but didn't make it that far. In fact, her train, and the train that the Duke of Edinburgh was on, was parked around the Bell Park golf course area. That's as far as it got, and they were driven downtown. And that same track is where the Discovery train made its debut in 1978, before going across Canada for, I think, at least 2 years.
Turbo train?
Turbo train never went south of the outer station. Yeah, it was considered too high speed. And here's what happened when you go south of the outer station. You run into this photo from the archives. This is how you got across Ontario Street to get to City Hall. You basically had to compete with cars, and the fellow worked in that switch tender's cabin, and he would come out and grant the CP trains right away on that shared 10th mile of track. So that's very kind of low tech at that time. You may not know that Kingston was a big deal in 1956 to mark the first Grand Trunk completion of the line, meeting of the trains. A train of enthusiasts came from Toronto and one from Montreal. They met here. They dined at the old former LaSalle Hotel. And there's Omer LaValle, who was one of preeminent CP historians. And they toured the CLC plant. When I say CLC, I'm referring to Canadian Locomotive Company. And at that time, if you can think, they were building diesels and they were still building steam engines in 1956 for India. What a crossover. Wow, I think that's pretty late. But they exported a lot of locomotives. And then they watched and saw the kick and push train come in after and then departed back to their home cities. Where did these tracks go? Well, as I mentioned, there's a severe curve. And this is sort of where everything started. Elliott Avenue goes up the center of the picture, roughly, and sort of cuts that curve. The CP, or the KMP, came in at the top of the photo, and my Hanley Spur, the CN line, just diverges at the bottom there and skirts the water going downtown. So here's what I was mentioning earlier about the realignment. You can see the severity of that black line coming across like a smile and going up towards the Cataract River. In the 70s, the CN said, we don't need a speed restriction there. We need to do something. So they drilled and they blasted and they cut into the limestone between Division and Montreal streets, which is the red line, which is still there. But what this, I call it the city map that drove around in our Volkswagen glove compartment for years, map shows is that the CP comes in at the top left. And where I have that first arrow is where that initial diamond crossing was. And sorry, the second arrow is where that initial diamond crossing was. The arrow at top left is where the bridge was built over a CN, and then it continues down the left side, cuts across by Railway Street, and then meets the CN Hanley Spur, and then they travel together downtown from about the Davis Tannery. This is from Gordon Smithson's excellent book, probably my favorite book, called At the Bend in the Road, and it shows the CP lifting that bridge that was over the CN tracks just near Division Street. It's really hard to find vestiges of most of this today. This is a picture my brother took from the Division Street overpass, and this is the now end of the KMP. So they came down from Dalton Avenue to your right, down across, you were standing on Division Street, then they'd have to go ahead into those two tracks that are there, leave cars for the CN that could then take them downtown for the CP. And that's the CN main line there. So this is where the kick and push ended up ending. Conversely, this is where the Hanley Spur begins. So when I was waiting there for my grandmother, looking down the track, this is looking the opposite way. So this is looking, I would say, timetable west. And the Hanley Spur diverges at the left and goes down to water level. And that's the outer station in the distance. Hope this is as clear as mud. So here's a photographic representation of what I've been saying. So the CN main line's at the top. The Hanley Spur comes down left towards the bottom. The CP, Kingston Pembroke, joins at the left. And there's the Davis Tannery and the smelters that are now gone. As we continue farther down in this series, you see the line goes quite straight. And both lines are beside each other. And in the middle of the picture, they cross River Street, or under the River Street Bridge, and then Cataraqui Street. The woolen mill is at the right of the photo, the extreme right. And then you're coming down towards North Street. This is the River Street Bridge. It was built over both lines. You know, I'm a model railroader. This kind of thing is something you might think a model railroad would come up with, because under that bridge, the two lines cross. Now, what are the chances they would build a bridge right over top of that spot? It is so bizarre, but it is also so cool. So the Grand Trunk had the right of way. The CP had to come in at a bit of an angle, cross them. There were signals, again, to make sure the trains shared the track properly. And you'll notice something about the bridge. The abutments have a gap, and there's some more bents or piers that are built in there. And I've documented that in 1942, the city agreed to raise that bridge by 2 feet to allow boilers and marine engines to be brought down to the shipyards. because it wouldn't have fit otherwise. So that's what accounts for that gap that's there.
Remember driving over, it was very steep on each side, noticeably steep.
That's steep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's steep.
Yeah. Yeah, it was incredibly steep, and coming down off it towards Rideau Street, you're kind of like, like it was a roller coaster, right? Yeah, and this guy tried to drive over the transport. I think he was going down to Orchard Street, took a wrong turn, and I think this was basically the end of that bridge. For obvious reasons, it was dangerous. This is the view off the bridge, looking north. So your Rideau Street is on your left. And what I mentioned is Conrex, which used to be McPherson, is off in the distance there. And this is actually a test of a unit, a diesel unit that was going to warmer climes in Guyana, which is being tested in the snow. It's a crazy picture. And the tannery is to the right. So it's out for a little jaunt. As we come farther down, you would pass North Street, the KNP Roundhouse is there right in the center. Then we come down through Anglin's, the other dry dock, which was later Canadian Dredge and Dock. Those white things extending to the inner harbor were docks that were used to transship ore and other materials to vessels. And there was a couple of docks that extended almost all the way across the inner harbor, which are called the spile docks, which were later taken out as a hazard to navigation. And at the bottom, you'll see the beginning of the Wellington Street Grand Trunk freight sheds, freight yard, some CP tracks, and then coal dealers on the right. Today, where those coal dealers are, bottom right, is the Frontenac Village condo community. So I should mention, right where that white part ends at the extreme right would be the edge of Anglin Bay. And at one time, that was an embankment that was built to bring the Grand Trunk line downtown. There were problems, however, because the drawbridge or swing bridge was an impediment. Apparently, it was very difficult to bring your sailboat or whatever vessel in through that gap, and this didn't help. And so William Anglin filed suit because it was affecting his business, because he had trouble getting ships to get into his dock. So due to that and other factors, the Grand Trunk line was flip-flopped. So basically went from the far right sort of to the bottom left corner on the other side of Kingston and Pembroke by 1890. And the swing bridge was removed. And I guess all were happy at that point. This is the Imperial Oil limestone warehouse you'll probably recognize. I have a series of photos on my blog, and every time 20, 30 years apart, it looks the same. Like exactly the same. There's the background changes, but I guess the concern at the turn of the 19th into the 1900s, turn of that century, were that there would be a conflagration downtown because of this oil. So they thought, what can we build a building out of to house oil that won't burn? Well, we got any limestone lying around? Well, they did. And as you may know, this is now being repurposed into living space now at North Street. So you can, and they've got a roof on it now. So it's looking very much like that. The Swampboard Inner Harbor History Project of Laura Murray and others took one of those things that you make soccer lines on a soccer pitch and divined where the kick and push turntable was. So that's what you see at left. So if you go to Doug Thuer Park and you see that tree or those trees, you will know that's what was there. And on the right is a period picture from maybe the early 70s before that turntable was removed and the roundhouse was taken down. This is a lovely photo to me. I just found online. Someone posted it all the way from England. But what this shows is that turntable at the roundhouse. If you've ever been down to the Urban KMP Trail, Doug Thuer Park, or this area, you'll recognize that retaining wall at the very far right. It's now an art installation.
Yes.
Same wall. So that will help orient you. And those oil tanks are gone. This is a rather big locomotive for our little line. I don't know why it was there, but this fellow ventured onto the turntable and got an excellent color photo of it. So I just thought I would include that. This was an intriguing photo for me. You again might think, well, it's just a picture of a train. Yes, it is. But when you scratch the surface, if you recall the gasification tanks that were down there And at the far left is the Richardson elevator. And I think under the black box is the dome of City Hall. You can't quite see it, but it's there. This is the Wellington Street train shed team tracks. And I looked at this photo, which was found by Bob Frey in a shoebox. It was published in the Whig, but the Whig picture is very difficult, but this is an excellent version. Now, what you'll notice is one of those things on the flat cars, they look interesting. They look to me like military vehicles, but our military as a country in 1939 was, after one world war and there wasn't going to be any further wars, why do we need a huge military? This was our anti-aircraft capability, or part of it. The concern was that Halifax was undefended. So there was a great effort to move this, whatever we had in Kingston, to the East Coast. That's what's happening in this picture. So they're being loaded on these flat cars. That's, again, a very large locomotive, even for the CN to take down there. So I thought, oh, why is that there? And by today's standards, the operational security is minimal. Look at the people walking up there and poking at stuff and standing around. There is not too much security going on. And some of the logos in one version of the picture are censored. You can't see it. So because it was early in the war, there was thought that we shouldn't give too much information potentially to the enemy. So where this is now is roughly where the McDonald Cartier building is, the OHIP building.
Direction does that look?
That is looking, I hate saying directions downtown because I always say east to west. Some people say it's south, but this is looking essentially, if you turn this way, you're on Wellington Street and you look a little bit that way towards downtown. So it's roughly looking from where do you know where Meadowcraft Marine is and the Lee Warden condo right about there, and looking over that way towards downtown.
Is that not Kingston City Hall Tower, the very top right?
Yes. So you're looking sort of whatever compass direction that is. Yeah, you're looking downtown.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say. This is another picture I stumbled across. It's just a train picture. But look at the top left. If you can see it there, there's two clues that point out exactly where this is. I'll give you a hint. It's again at Wellington Street. Yeah. Does anyone see a cask in a wall?
Yep.
Oh, the barrel.
Brewery.
Yeah.
Pages Brewery.
Yeah. The Bages Brewery on Wellington Street. The other clue is the end of the word England. And I think it was taken over by England at that time. It was obviously no longer a brewery. So this may look like just a train picture, but it really places it in that same spot in 1939. And what I think is happening here is he's waiting to get the okay to, you can see where a lot of those tracks go. They spread it like a fan. And what they do is line up the boxcars beside each other on pairs of tracks so they can go from one into the other and unload them that way. So it was a busy spot. This was before the 401. Yeah, now this is another picture that really intrigued me. And just this week, I went deep into it. I did a deep dive, as they say. What strikes you when you look at it? Obviously, a lot of soldiers. Yeah, but you have to remember that any Canadian Pacific passenger train that would come downtown would have at the most 2 or at most 3 cars. You can see at least 6 here. Some of them are sleeping cars. The date is November 1950. So these fellows are from various support units of the Canadian Army, the signals, the engineers, and the medical corps, and they're boarding this train, and it's going to go to Fort Lewis, Washington, and it's going to prepare them there for the Korean conflict. So I think the guy at the bottom left is what I would call a railway dick. He looks like if you thought of what's a spy look like, or an anti-spy, it might look like him. So, yeah, he just fits the part, doesn't he? You see some of these. Anyway, I thought this was a great photo and a rare photo. So I think George Lilly took this. He was actually standing on the loading platform. I pretty much tried to triangulate it, and at that location. The inner harbor is not the cleanest part of Kingston, unlike what the Count thought. He thought it was the pleasantest harbor he'd just about ever seen. But when you look at this, it doesn't look pleasant. To me, it looks interesting. It looks grimy. It looks dirty. It looks industrial. That's what I like, not what the tourists like. And you can see the Fort Frontenac there, the causeway, bridge is raised, and all that whole area I've been talking about is dead center, if you can make it out. Those freight sheds, and all that gritty railway stuff right there. And in case you think this is all stuff of, eons ago, in 1976, as witnessed by this picture in the wig, they were still bringing cars of coal to Plastnarm. That's a Pennsylvania Railroad car. And these guys are trying to dig out that frozen switch across from Fort Frontenac. So imagine standing, I think it's around the slush puppy place. And this kind of looks like slush puppy weather, not, but anyway, they're fighting with that switch. And that's 1976. It's not really coals to Newcastle, but it sort of looks like a castle. As you continued on south of Ontario Street, you would see this, which was the Crawford coal shed. And again, if you look closely, there's quite an ingenious way they had of bringing in coal, because coal at that time was king. So you had a lot of different sizes of coal. And they had boards between the tracks. And I think what happened there is they take the boards out of the way, they would put an elevator there, and then they had all those little portholes in the top of the coal shed, and they would put the elevator down through that, and the coal would fall into the down below, and they can put it in the truck. This is taken from the cab of a kick and push train coming into Kingston. At this point, there is exactly one track, and I'll talk about some triangular shaped buildings in a minute. And when I do, you can just see them right. This is where that is. Dead center is the triangular shaped buildings. The back of them is angled. You can still go to the Holiday Inn, and if you look over east of there, you will see these buildings. And that's because the rail line came in there, went right across the center of this picture to the KMP station across from City Hall. There's a Richardson elevator at the bottom left, some of the feed mills, coal dealers, gritty stuff, not a tourist destination. And in case you're wondering, why do they call it Hanley? That says Hanley Spur namesakes. Thomas Hanley and Frederick Bolger opened their ticket agency on Brock Street. They then moved it into part of the Anglo-American Hotel, which was getting closer to this building. And in 1886, they moved into this building, and that should say Joseph and Cleary Hanley were some of the ticket agents there. So it's the Hanley Spur, named after this family, who had a long-standing association with that area. Although later, when the station was closed, again, everything changed in 1930, they went over to Princess Street. So you can tell there, it was a busy place, and there's also a freight station there. Another quote I came across I like, Kingston's really distinguished town hall, constructed years before the railroad came and designed to overlook the sweeping expanse of the river, now faces the CPR's unbeautiful station and yards. Boo. Drab freight cars are shunted and hauled immediately in front of that hall's dignified, pillared and porticoed facade, a glum reminder in some of its aspects that progress can be uncouth. Well, if you talk to people who saw that area at that time, it was not a tourist destination, and people would drive by City Hall and they go, look, City Hall, isn't it beautiful? Oh, when they looked across the street. So does it look better in color? I don't think so. This is a little later, 1960, and the elevator, Richard elevator is gone. You can see Shoal Tower sitting sort of forlorn and unneeded out in the water. There's the remnants of the CP freight yard still there. And City Hall does not have its portico at that point. So I call this early 60s. Nice color view. And you can see the immense Crawford coal piles at bottom right I was talking about. Coal was still in much use then. If you think Ontario Street is a beautiful condo-lined waterfront street of today, it was not always. This was the end of Ontario Street. Can you imagine driving Ontario Street and you have to drive through these things? I don't think it was much of a through street, but those gantries were built out into the street to unload or load freight cars. And I believe that's a funnel for a vessel that left. I don't know if it's coming or going. I'll have to research that. But that's 1950 on the left. And those gantries were there as late as 1968 on the right. So they were to carry equipment into those buildings that are there at the shipyards. These two pictures tell quite a story. They're both on Ontario Street. They're both of the locomotive plant, the CLC plant. The locomotives on the left were a failure. They were based on American design. They were bought by CN. They were returned to CLC as being unsatisfactory. The ones on the right were also built here. I don't want to run down CLC, but it's just a historical fact. The ones on the right, have you ever heard of training someone to do your job? But look at that little steam engine pulling those diesels out. What's he thinking? These guys are gonna take my job away. They're so much more efficient. But the interesting thing about these new units that are being hauled out of there for CN is that most diesels built by CLC only lasted 20 years in railway service. They were not long lasting. They did not have long careers with the railways. And in both cases, the main reason is that CLC was late to partner with a company that had diesel designs. They were stuck in the steam mode and they were sort of late to the party. And so their diesels never really took off. And that eventually would spell the demise of the plant, among other reasons. So one of my main focuses to learn about these realistic model trains I want to run is what industries were here. Well, you might ask, why were there downtown spurs? Which came first, the industries or the trains? Well, I would say the industries, because they needed the railway to bring in and take out everything. The city gave a lot of tax exemptions. There was a lot of boosterism to get companies to locate here for economic reasons. And what we sometimes forget, because there is no sign of it left, is that CLC was the second largest locomotive producing company in all of Canada, next only to Montreal Locomotive Works. And the giant steam engines were dragged out to the main line through Kingston. Everyone that was built was taken out through there, up Rideau Street. And it's just hard to conceive of that sort of thing, that we had that kind of impact on the Canadian transportation system. And there I list a few of the businesses that were down there. This is a list of companies that I found were given, voted on tax exemptions by the city over the years to encourage them. So the Montreal Transportation Company elevators, where the Wolf Island Ferry Dock was, Carrington's Tannery, Davis Tannery, the Broom Factory, Rideau Street, Cotton Mills was the woolen mill, the James Richardson elevator near the foot of Brock Street, Kingston Elevator and Transit was near the Marine Museum. It's part of it's still there as a condo. CLC, Davis Tannery, two foundries and smelters that were near the Inner Harbor. Kingston Building was also near the Marine Museum now. Shipbuilding Company was at those gantries I just showed you. And then Reliance Molding, which was directly opposite the outer station and was many companies over the years that operated there. And Frontenac Thorn Wall Tile was also one of those. As we come down from the outer station area in the late 40s, there was a wave of warehouses that were going to be served by trucks, but they were going to receive their raw material feedstock by train. And I think almost all of these have relocated, closed, downsized. And we liked our big industries. There's the Davis Tannery, looked very prosperous at left, and it was. There's the Hulk it became, and then it became brownfields. And Kingston, as we know, is home to several brownfields that the city has been trying to do something with. There's the Cohen Scrapyard. On my layout, I like scrapyards. That's the Cohen Scrapyard. There's the Imperial Oil warehouse we talked about. That's the only remnant of the oil tanks that were down along Rideau Street, is that truck loading material equipment that's there. And then over at Canadian Dredge, that's the dredge primrose that's scuttled in 1984 and had to be raised. Doesn't exactly give a real positive feel about Kingston industry as it turned out heavy industry, let's say. But for my purposes, poking around in the Queen's archives, when I found things like this was gold to me. These are actual artifacts you can go and see. One is an actual car that brought steel from the United States and went into a ship that was built here. The other is an actual car. Someone wrote all those things by hand. That was a load of hides that went to the Davis Tannery. And even though that's a little bit before my era, you sort of have to learn what came first before you can look at what came later. Early on, I mentioned this former refrigerator car of potatoes. The interesting thing about that, my dad and I would drive all around Kingston Saturday mornings. He was a big photocopying fan before there was the internet. So we'd go into the Douglas Library, he would photocopy stuff. We'd go to the hobby store, we'd go to S&R. Maybe we'd see a train, extremely rare. But this day, blowing around in the grass, I found the background, which is a switch list that the crew wrote out to switch these cars in all the industries downtown in 1979. And the fourth one up from the bottom says SLC 232. And that's an actual car I got a picture of. That is the only time I ever got a picture down there. And these guys had written it on there, and you see the track number matches, and at the far right, it says Protroci Spuds. That's what it was, because I could see the tag on the actual. This is my one and only artifact. So thank you for letting me share it with you. It's a scrappy old piece of paper. But let's not forget about CLC. 3,000 locomotives plus came out of there. Not a sign of it now. They named a condo after it, the locomotive works. That's it. Maybe it's a better use of the land. I don't know. It was landlocked. They couldn't expand there. They couldn't expand. But you can see the curve. They built 1,000 locomotives by 1911, another 1,000 in the next 30 years, and another 1,000 in the next 16 years. So the curve was going up, but it flattened. That's the 2,000 locomotive produced right in the middle of the war. And things were pretty drab back then, but they did manage to paint it up and give it the number 2,000. That was just not its CP number, but that was for publicity purposes. And in case you think the Marine Museum and the dry dock is just for the Kuwaitan and the Alexander Henry, we were building 108 ships there of various types, including during the war, corvettes. And we even built a lake vessel that saw service in the upper lakes with pulpwood, the DC Everest. That's when it's being launched. History is not always glamorous, but I love this photo. It's a car full of scrapings of cow hides that have been pushed down this I don't know, slide. That's money for somebody. Somebody's bought this, you know, they're going to ship it to their plant, use it for something, but this is at the Davis Tannery. That is not glamorous, but I love it. What happened? Well, we tried to have a transshipment model. We tried to have the Kingston and Pembroke bring mineral wealth, lumber to Kingston. And Kingston was going to be the great economic driver of maybe the Great Lakes or Eastern Canada, where we're going to ship this out by ship. But we never became that booming. We never became a Hamilton, right? So we were too close to other cities, perhaps. The canal started opening up. Lake freighters got bigger. It is said that once the seaway opened, it just meant the bigger ships could go past Kingston. In other words, they weren't coming to Kingston in the first place, and now they're just going to, bigger ships are going to sail by, going down to Quebec and so on. Everyone wanted a car. We didn't want to ride trains anymore. Everyone wanted their goods delivered by truck. Companies thought it was cheaper, and so on. So even the newer sites that we developed in Kingston during the war were outside of the downtown. Alcan, DuPont, they're outside of downtown. And as I mentioned, CLC and other industries just would not or could not grow with the times, it seemed. This is the final edition. This is Scott Haskell photo. And this is a load of newsprint that's being delivered to the Whig Standard warehouse on Rideau Street. The building is still there. That's the NGB Studios, just at the other end of the boxcar, which used to be the National Grocers building. And the CN line is what he's standing on. The CP line, which is that cinder bed at the right, has already been ripped up. It's gone. That is the parking lot of the woolen mill behind those, behind that metal. And it's Harold's Demolition Scrapyard at that point. So that's where we are.
That's where the two rails came together.
They're absolutely together. Yeah, and in the distance, Paul, you see that River Street Bridge, and that's where they crossed. So they literally were parallel, just a few feet apart. So that's why I kind of grouped them together sometimes. There is an interesting story that the Kingston Rowing Club used to keep its skulls in that newsprint warehouse. And one time there was a boxcar in the way. They couldn't get out. So fortunately the boxcar was empty. So they just slid the door open and walked right through and passed it and took it down to the water to the right.
Rocky Street, cross that?
Cataraqui Street, yes, that is Cataraqui Street right there. So yeah, just where that yellow oil tank is Rosen's. So right across there. Yeah,
Yeah, I was wondering.
you're right. So then we had, as I say, transshipping. We tried to have sawmills. We had coal, we had oil. It was at water level. There are great hopes for it. But now, I would call it gentrification. There's probably a better term for it than that. But I think we all want to see this area come up in the world and not be an industrial area anymore. We've seen evidence of that. Coal to condos, rails to trails. Workers used to live there. They were close to where they worked in the mills, but now it's Rideau Crest. Maybe that's a better use of that land. Shipbuilding is still at Meadowcraft Marine. Freight shed is government offices, probably generating more money for the city and jobs and so on. But there's our little broom factory. And that's my model of it at the top. That's my 2001 picture in the middle. And when the Wellington Street extension was proposed, they were going to bulldoze that basically or go right through there. I was contacted by someone that said, we want to save it and we like to use your picture. Because whoever took pictures of those places, well, I took one. So I said, sure, use it. And look at it today. It's a prosperous little building called the Broom Factory, and there's lots going on there.
Your local Mike's there for Gregory.
Yeah,
Pretty talented.
yeah, it's a cultural space. It's a working space. I got to get in that cafe. I bet it's expensive, but I bet it's good. It looks good. That's my goal. Anyhow, what remnants are there today that you can go out and see of what I've been talking about? Well, frankly, very little. Doug Fleur Park, if you walk the urban KMP trail, I think there's a 20-foot section of track there to say, this is what used to be here. The diagonal of those buildings along Ontario Street near the Holiday Inn, near Queen Street, still there. That's why they were built that way, because the track was there first. Both passenger stations are still standing downtown. The KMP one is the Tourist Information Center. And as I mentioned, the restaurant and the other one. But interestingly, and I actually looked at Snapshot Kingston, the city's map function, and I could see that when Montreal Street was realigned, taken out from under the tracks and that the bridge removed, that you can still see the, what I would call abutments of the bridge still there on the front lawn of the Village by the River apartments. So you can sort of tell where that line went. So that you really have to look for them, is my point. And to find somebody that worked in those industries, almost impossible. You might find their kids. They might have vague memories of them, but it's a long time ago now. So history is passing us by. So in the 1970s, there's a CN document. Each of those lines of writing is a business. On the right, that's, I think, 1995. This is what it's become, which is fine. It's just totally different. It's completely changed. When you look at a list of industries, this was printed in a book commemorating the coronation. Oh, look at Kingston. Look what we have. And here's a list of our industries. Well, only 4.5 of these still exist. That's Alcan, the first two, Alcan and Invista. The Millhaven Terraline plant, bulldozed. Canadian Locomotive Company, bulldozed. Shipyards, museum. Woolen Mill, that's the half. It's still going. It's never been vacant. Gould Battery is technically still going. Preston Steel on Cassidy, Maple Street. Tannery, bulldozed. Frontenac, Floor Tile, gone. Katie Manufacturing, gone. The grain elevator at Elevator Bay, gone. But we still have Metalcraft Marine, and we still have Dyco, or I think now it's called Sensient Technologies, which is on Orchard Street, and it's still producing. So out of all those, basically that's what we have left. So my question is, where are these being built today? Not here. As the locomotive plant wound down and the contracts dried up, they tried to build other things, and they were pretty successful at it. Construction equipment, mining equipment, various industrial applications like this huge tank sitting along Ontario Street, waiting to go up to the main line. It's just that we're not building them today, and maybe that's okay, but that's what was there. So as I'm transitioning into my model world, I'll show you some transitions. I call this deer photograph. If you ever feel sentimental and you want to feel more sentimental, go to deer photograph. It's a site where people take up a picture and hold it up, say, in front of their childhood home, and they talk about their parents who were deceased or whatever. It's actually very, very endearing, but it makes you kind of sad. But this is what they do. So I printed off some archival photos, and I went and stood along the waterfront. So these are the apartments near the Marine Museum, and that's a RCMP boat, patrol boat that's being built at the shipyards. This is the Frontenac Village condo community. Those are coal boats that are loading, unloading from one into the other, then onto the shore. And also where oil tankers were unloaded in that same spot. This is opposite City Hall. Look at that nice stack of pallets in the unloading platform. Very workaday. You know, this is the economy happening, but that's a Milwaukee Road boxcar that's been brought in there right across from City Hall. The commerce that was taking place there is pretty amazing. This is the headquarters building of the Canadian Locomotive Company, which was taken down and became Empire Life's parking lot. That corner there, Yeah, a nice building. There's the opposite corner. I call it, well, it was a lot of things, that limestone building at the right. It was a meat market, it was a doctor's office, it was a drugstore. Bottom line is it's still there. But the locomotive plant in that archival print is not, but there's the condos. So I can literally match it up to what was there. Look at this one. The winter work of the shipyards, both dry docks, was repairing lake boats. Imagine the time it took to build that scaffolding and take off those plates and replace them that have been battered by ice and docks and age. Wow. In that same spot that's now where the Q8 is. Almost got killed here. I'm standing in the middle of Ontario Street, holding up my picture and trying to, this guy almost got me, but I survived. These are those triangular buildings I'm talking about across from the Smith Robinson building. Yeah. So you can, and the ferry dock is at the left. So that's why they're triangular. You can see the cross flux in the middle of the street there. You can see the tracks going across. That was the shared section that fellow sat in that shed for and flagged the trains across, because both railways shared that 10th of a mile.
You have TV there now on a dragon building?
Yes. Yes. The building that's open right there. Yeah.
big TV.
It catches your eye when you come into town. That's that same spot. SNR. Yeah. Exactly. What did I do all this for? Well, you might ask you. So there I am in my empire. 10 by 11 feet of some of the prime real estate in our house given over to a model train. But I let my wife share the other half of the room. She has craft space, so it's all very diplomatic, but I used to have a whole room. But what I'm able to do, and I'll show you some of these pictures, is take pictures, sort of recreate what it used to look like. And by posting them to Facebook, I got unintended media interest. You can see there. I've been able to write a couple of articles about it. So I'm spreading the word about Kingston to basically a national or maybe international audience, spreading our history. And the amazing connections, such as this one here tonight, which I'm very grateful for, and others, people have come to my door during the pandemic and told me stories. None of this would have happened except for these model trains. I couldn't have written it. I just shake my head all the time. The life turns that life gives us. Here we are in the layout room. Look at that. After a hard day, you can go watch the trains run. So there's CN and CP together. So previously it was Winnipeg, it was Vancouver, it was Vermont, but I finally came home to Kingston. That's Vermont there, as you can tell. That doesn't look much like Kingston. This is what I'm modeling. So roughly 1970. Everything I'm doing is built to look like that. Now, clearly, full disclosure, some of these industries were gone by 1970. So how can you model? But work with me a little bit. There's a few years either way, usually earlier, where I can justify things. For instance, this was Conrax, and it was McKelvey and Birch, McPherson on Rideau Street, just before Railway Street in Montreal, where it came in. Clearly, they've written the name of the company in, as they used to do, to make it look very impressive. And that's my version of it at right. And it's about 1.5 feet long, and it sits in the corner of the room. So that's what I'm trying to represent. Here we are. Again, I was down there in 1979 with my Instamatic, taking a picture of Canadian dredge and dock tugboat in the dry dock. And there's my very limited model version of Seine. The workers, I mean, it's all about people, right? History is people. So I've taken figures, I've painted them, I've posed them. And there's these guys, and you can see the name at top left, Canadian Dredge and Dock. That place is where this is. And they were a busy little place. Busiest perhaps during the Seaway construction. They're doing a lot of dredging up and down the river.
Metalcraft is?
Yes, they're very same. So it's still alive. It's 1898 dry dock, still in use. That's pretty good. This is my layout in a sketch, and that shows the very convoluted. I tried to fit in everything I wanted to fit in. It's not anatomically correct. We looked at, in our Associated Railroaders of Kingston group, doing modules of this line. And we ended up with about 80 modules that would fill this room if you were to do the whole thing in scale. We lack length in model railways. We never have the length that we need. We have maybe some of the depth, but we never have the distance. We can never, because it just takes up too darn much room. So I've squeezed as much as I can in there.
You need a bigger house.
Well, yeah, probably so. But it's so daunting when you get that big basement looking at you. I gotta fill this thing, it's 10 by 11 I find is manageable, and it's actually the most complete iteration I've had of the layout. So basically I have 12 industries served by CN in a 21-foot run. And you're gonna say, how can you cram all in? Well, a lot of the spurs to our industries were short because there wasn't a lot of space. So they only accommodate 1 or 2 cars, so they don't have to be long. And here's the local switcher that was based at the outer station, and they're switching Imperial Oil. This is a list of what my research has led to. So these are industries that I portray, what the commodities are that come in, go out, and the car types, box cars, tank cars, that sort of thing. So this is really what the research has led to. So I'm not too much like Sheldon. I'm actually running model trains purposely. And this is the CP network that I have, 15 industries and 17 feet. These trains would have come from Smiths Falls via Titchburn. They weren't really based in Kingston to a great degree. And there they are switching Swords coal at Plastar or Anglin's coal. And there's the Imperial Oil Warehouse and oil tanks in the background. And a similar list for CP that you see there. And these are the buildings I built. So this is the outer station. Full disclosure, you never see the front of it, so there's no windows on the front, but there's windows on the back where you see it when you come into the layout room. This is the Bages Brewery at right. And it's about almost a foot square. And to get that limestone look, I just printed off on my home printer. It's just basically a pattern, and I just glue it to the plastic. This was fun a couple years ago. I didn't want to spend all summer inside. It's nice weather, so I went to the summer and said, I'm going to build a coal and scrapyard. And then I'm going to take it inside and drop it into place. So that's what I did. So I got the track coming in there at left, the little rows, piles of scrap. And then I literally just dropped it onto the layout at right. It was like a prefab thing. It was done. And it was enjoyable doing that outside. This is my version of the Imperial Oil warehouse. And here they're getting barrels of oil and lubricants there. This is a street. It could be Wellington Street. I'm not saying that I modeled everything foot for foot because, again, I don't have the room. So it's representative of what's there. That's the city steam laundry at left and the Bages Brewery that were on Wellington Street. And as you can see, the workers and the families live there. Like they weren't in the suburbs, there were no bedroom. They lived right there and they walked to work when those businesses were booming. This is the current Kingstown School, my version of it, on Rideau Street. It's where my grandsons go to school. This in 1970 was Warren Plumbing Supply, and now it's a school. So it's come full circle as a school. This is, I don't know if you have your eyes checked at the Galen Eye Center down there by the end of the causeway. It was Millard and Lum. It's the bones of the same building. And a couple of fellows from CLC went in on their own, and they did the ship service business in that building at Plastar, which is still there. And here's my representative CN train coming along Montreal Street, doing its thing, keeping the wheels of Canadian commerce turning. And you can still see on my layout, CN and CP doing their thing, switching the various industries, taking cars in and out along Rideau Street. Shameless plug. They're not that new, but they're newish books. The first one's out of print, I'm sorry. I do have a few copies of the second one here if you're interested, and I have a special price, $25 if you're interested. I'm very proud to say they were printed by Allen Graphics here in Kingston. You can see how many, and I do donate it to the Queen's Archives, $1 per copy, because they've been instrumental in the success of these. This was the first one. I was again proud to feature a picture my dad took when we visited. We used to come up from Quebec. We're coming off the Wolf Island Ferry. A train comes across their city hall. Like imagine that today. And he had his camera, took it through the windshield. I can just imagine what my mother was saying. She had no patience for waiting for trains. So I guess opposites attract. But he snapped this, and I was so proud to include that on the cover. And the second one, I just found there were too many stories The first book was mainly facts, dates, train facts and that sort of thing. So in the second one, I envisioned someone walking along these streets and talking about their experiences. And this is the one that I have a few copies left of. But I'm a picture guy, and I had 150 photos that the archives kindly let me reproduce, and I wanted to share those. So in terms of resources for you, I would suggest if you can find a copy, if you're interested in the train business, At the Bend in the Road is the best book. But we have Stephen Manders here, and his book, The First Spike, is also excellent. To read about what happened north of Kingston, especially, and in the area. There are 2 books on the KNP that you may still find. The excellent book on CLC was by McQueen and Thompson. I've also used fire insurance maps, various news clippings, and that map from our glove compartment that I mentioned earlier. And these are other online resources that the Canadian Science and Technology Museum has, the photo archives of CLC, Queen's Archives, I can't mention enough, Vintage Kingston Facebook, the city's Snapshot Kingston tool. And if you want to see what I've been up to, I've got, I think, over 400 posts since 2018 on my blog. It's hanleyspur.blogspot.com. I'm sure if you just Google Hanley Spur, it'll come up. And you can see the model and the prototype. And if you have any questions, I say thank you.
Eric, what a lovely evening of meticulous research, nostalgia, and loving research. Thank you very much. I was particularly struck by the fact that you have nostalgia for this world you've just described, but you understand why it had to pass. I mean, we live in an era when coal, oil, etc., are clearly fading out of our civilization slowly. But as you point out, they built our city. So it was very effectively conveyed, I thought. Thanks, Duncan. We'll take some questions. Let me just begin by one. Am I right in saying that the Hanley of the Hanley Spur was after Senator William Hanley?
That I'm not sure of.
I think you'll find he was co-owner of the locomotive company,
Yes.
along with the Birmingham family here in Kingston. The point here would be, we know, thanks to Sir John and a number of other politicians, that railways and politics are intertwined. And I imagine there's quite a good story about getting the spur down here close, as you say, to the locomotive company.
Yes. I'm sure there was more than a little political will that was used there to do that. I dabbled in a bit of the Hanley genealogy, but I didn't go deep into it, so I won't argue.
They were Irish Catholics, and we're not used to Irish Catholics being prominent capitalists in Canada. But you go out to St. Mary's Cemetery here, the 2 of them are buried side by side, and in tombs obviously striving to outdo the other. Now, questions, please, for Eric.
I should add that I got so excited. Seeing your pictures and the stories as I've gotten to know the area. Well, I had a hard time restraining myself from interjecting. But I did my best. Thank you very much. I quite enjoyed it. Because you showed a lot of the old pictures, like the Imperial Oil place. I remember going with my father there once and bought a barrel of oil. I'm now in the Cataraqui Canoe Club down by the woolen mill. I'm down there regularly, so I've gotten to know a lot of that really well. But as you go through it all, it was, wow, I know that.
Yeah.
A little bridge at Rideau River Street. Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry, I should add that when I first got, I'm there with you. When I first got the Smithson book, I was flipping back and forth. I was sticking Post-it notes in it. Same as on page 37, because I really knew nothing. And you might think that's odd, having been here since I was 5. But we were in Amherst, so we weren't really over there. So when I was a teenager with my dad, that was probably my first exposure to that. But what I've tried to do recently is do what you suggest, is try to frame it somehow. Sometimes when you do that, you sort of cover over the image. You put a big arrow, this is such and such, kind of covers it over. But it is really important to orient it because it is so hard to see what was there and to correlate it with what's there now.
A quick question, because trains are trains, but trains need tracks. My question is, who built the tracks? If you build a railway from Kingston to Pembroke, who works on it? Who gave the money? Did the railways own their own construction companies? Or were these companies that came from other places? Did they use local labor or did they,
Great
could
question.
you elaborate on that?
Yes, I will. Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is, generally, it's not, I don't dabble too much in the 1850s and 70s, but of course I have a passing knowledge. And I do know that I don't think it was the safest, the easiest, or the most favorable to the workers kind of job you could have. It was dangerous. It was dirty. You could be killed very easily. And I think what they tended to do, like with the CPR, is bring people from elsewhere. And who hired them was contractors, railway contractors. So I think each railway that was built, they would find a contractor. Okay, we want you to, okay, we'll do it for this much money. We'll find the people, we'll source the materials, and we'll build it. So I think in later years, the railways built their own lines. But I think early on, like some of those, you find a lot of contractors. We know that the Kingston and Pembroke had a lot of Italian workers. We know the CP had workers from China. And the arc of those people's experience tended to be, once we're done with you, you can go away now. You built our railway, and they were probably sometimes happy to do that because they go on to the next job, you know. But I think a lot of it was wrapped up in politics. And wrapped up in economics, and somebody was making money off this. And I don't think it was those guys drilling rock that Stephen has really talked about well in his book, drilling rock and turning those rock drills and hitting them with hammers and stuff flying in their eyes for pennies a day. Those guys weren't getting rich on that, unfortunately.
A little bit on that. I put a lot of time in on that particular subject and have the only collection of original real steel rails in Canada. So the first kilometer of the KMP Railway, you see rails made in Wales by CWM Avon Works. And I have a display I take around the countryside of a portable museum. You're quite right, it was different contractors and they really treated the people badly. If they got blown up in an explosion, they didn't even bother recording their names, sending a letter home. Often they didn't get paid at the end of the summer. It was really that bad. And then you're quite right with what you're saying. It was really, really bad. A lot of Italians. The one railway, the CPR, where it goes across Smiths Falls, north into Depot Lakes, Tamworth, that was built by the Campbellford, Lake Ontario, and Western Railway. And they had a bad explosion there at Depot Lakes that killed a dozen men. And they're buried at the Annunciation Catholic Cemetery at Piccadilly. I had a hard time tracking down that railway, but it turns out it was just a name used by a bunch of CPR executives who did the dirty work under agreement to sell it when it was built to the CPR. The CPR didn't want their name associated with all this dirty work going on. They contracted it out deliberately. It was bad.
Yeah. Labor relations.
One ethnic group that hasn't been mentioned here were the Irish. Now, the Rideau Canal was built by what were called Irish navvies. The same was true of the railways. Think of Gordon Lightfoot's song, "We are the navvies who work on the railway, breaking our backs in the hot afternoon sun." The Irish, out west, you're right, the Chinese, but it was the Irish who provided this kind of labor. Another thing that struck me is that another spin-off of this, just as you suggested in Kingston, was the Canadian steel industry, because the 19th century was a great era of steel. Think of Bismarck, iron and blood. And Canada not only wanted railways, but they wanted the feedstock that went into railways. And rails, although mundane as they seem, were very important. And in 1903, the Laurier government passed what they called a bonus legislation, that every ton of steel made in Canada for rails was bonused, pushing that business towards places like Sault Ste. Marie and Hamilton. So the railways were important as a multiplier effect, as the economists talk about. And
I should add, when you mentioned Kingston and Pembroke, when it was taken over by CFE, and I said it was a paper railway, there were several paper railways, like Stephen mentioned, that, well, they were railways at one time, but really now they're part of our system. And they would have a shareholders meeting. Anybody had any business to conduct with the Kingston and Pembroke Railway, the Lake Erie Northern Railway, the Grand River Railway, you could go to the Royal York, you could go to a salon, and they would have a meeting for these paper railways that was scheduled for 20 minutes. It was a paper rail. No one was going to come in there and say, hey, I want to do, because it really didn't exist. But even when they moved to Calgary, they were still hosting these meetings at Gulf Canada Square, I believe, in Calgary, where if you had something to say about the Kingston Premier, you had to be heard. I don't imagine anyone ever did, but they would publish these notices in the paper. You think, wow, what a leftover that is.
Well, there was another gain here, that if you took over a railway, you often got all the goodies that came with it from the initial incorporation. Land grants, bonus for each mile made, etc. There were also federal provincial gains, typically Canadian, where you would see a railway that stretched across the provincial line, allowing them to dip into the kind of bonuses on each side of the line. And if you bought this up, it went into your treasury eventually, whether you used it or not.
Very true.
Yeah.
Some of you will know George Dillon, I'm sure. Yeah, George's a friend of mine. I took him to, along with others, to Gettysburg once, and we took the steam train up from Gettysburg up to whatever, and had a chicken dinner there. So while we were all eating chicken, guess what George was doing? He was looking at the locomotive. He came back and said, come and look at the plate on this locomotive. And that was 1,000 and something. And it was Kingston, Ontario, Canada,
Yeah.
on the nameplate.
Yeah. Some of those locomotives, I think it's a 1200 class of the CP. Interestingly, two of those locomotives were bought by someone in Winnipeg. Two of those locomotives came back to Canada. And one of those locomotives is going to be brought back into service in southwestern Ontario. So the legacy continues.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is, but George Dillon, I talk about trying to work retroactively back into the past, but George Dillon knew all that stuff. He lived that stuff. He wrote articles in the Wig that I read. He supplied to our group a nice drawing of the streets. And wow, I wonder where he got that. But as a result of what I've done, somebody sent me an email and he said, hey, I have a CN property plan from 1945. And I brought it along with me, but it's 5 feet long and it shows the entire 2 miles. And so I ended up with my own copy, just like George had a copy. I had a copy of this thing. And I went into Staples and said, this is a PDF. How big is this going to be if you print it? Well, it's 36 inches wide. It's going to be 120 inches. It's 120 inches. Is that about 10 feet long? Where am I going to stash this in my basement? How am I going to get this past my wife, getting in the door and into the basement? So I said, would you please print it 18 inches wide? But it's beautiful. And I look at something like that and my mind goes there. And I think, what happened here? What happened here? Yeah. And George would be right in that.
Be right
in that space for sure. Yes.
Any other questions?
I don't see any online.
I sort of slipstream in your wonderful enthusiasm for trains. We, in the summer, have taken, like Paul, a number of these trains, and I like talking to the engineers. Smith Falls Museum, that's wonderful. They tell me a couple of things. One, it's very hard to get coal for trains now. It has to be hard. Is it anthracite, I believe? Yeah. And they have to bring it in from Pennsylvania, which is expensive. The other problem they have is that a long time, for a generation, there were still people who worked on CN and CP who knew how a steam engine worked. And they're all pretty much dead now. That's why many of them just have diesels.
Yeah, that's really my point about saying that people who worked in these industries have to be at least 70, maybe 90 years old now. And in the waning years of steam engines, people got nostalgic. People put steam locomotives in parks. People wanted to keep them going. And those old heads that worked the steam engines knew that stuff. They didn't last forever. And so all that technology was superseded, all that labor was gone. But what it also shows us is how many jobs the railways provided, because a lot of their processes were very inefficient. Like coal, okay, we're going to fill the locomotive with coal, but how do we get the coal up there to come down by gravity? In Montreal and some Brockville, they built these huge trestles that went up maybe 100 feet over, I don't know, 1,500 feet. And they pushed this car full up there and they dumped it. Well, someone had to be up there. Someone had to be at the bottom end. Someone had to be loading the tender with that coal. Someone had to do, when the diesels came along and CLC started building diesels, the labor pool just completely shrunk. And all those jobs basically evaporated. So if you know someone in Kingston who's been here a while, they might say, oh, so-and-so worked for CN, so-and-so worked here. It provided a lot of jobs.
Think how long it took them to get rid of the position of firemen on the diesel engines, really.
Yeah,
You know,
it was contentious. In fact, we're doing tag team here. In fact, where you started on the railway was as a wiper. Can you imagine going up to somebody and saying, I work in the shops. Oh, that sounds great. What's your job? I'm a wiper. Like, they give you this piece of cotton waste with oil and say, go wipe the engine, make it look nice. And you're there wiping this thing. And these things are huge. Everything in the railroad is big, it's heavy, and it takes up a lot of space. And that's how you started out. Whereas today, you can be hired by one of Canadian Railways as a conductor right off the bat. So they don't have to work up through trainmen, brakemen, firemen. You go right to conductor because all those positions are gone. So there's 2 guys on a train. There's a few in Belleville, let's say, as a terminal. There's not hundreds of people working there. Everything's been so flattened, and nobody wants to have the job as a wiper anymore. But back in the day, this was probably your entry level job into a pension, into a good paying job. Your kids would be hired by the railway. So,
you know, my wife religiously reads the obits in the Globe, and it's quite striking how often you will see someone as being 38 years with CN or 44 years with CP. That is a career pattern that's passing.
in fact, a lot of those guys made it 60 years, 55 years, because they worked their way up and they had no other experience to speak of. Now, the Kingston industries, there was a lot of movement between industries. When one would close, say they would go from the shipyards to Alcan, they'd move around. You see a lot of that sort of movement of labor. But the railways would employ someone and you could run a steam engine at 60 miles an hour on the way to Toronto and you could be 75 years old. Can you imagine that today? People would be like, where's my golden handshake? I'll take it.
We had a speaker last year from the Smith Falls
Yes.
Railway, Eastern Ontario Railway Museum, and I went up there this summer and it was a wonderful day. They make money by using their steam train as a movie prop, but it's a bit of an illusion because they can't run that engine anymore for the reasons we were just talking about, but also because of liability insurance. So what they do is they hook up at the very end of the train a little electric shunting engine. They have a steam canister underneath the steam train and a noise track. And so the scenes we see in movies of, as you say, your grandmother arriving at the station look authentic, but they aren't. It's a complete construction.
I know some people in Manitoba who were involved in the CBC production of the sleeping car porter, the porter, something like that. Maybe you've seen it, yeah. Good show about, again, labor related, that Black Canadians, the pinnacle of their job experience in Canada might be to be a sleeping car porter. Because you were dealing with top of white or Canadian society, and you were a valuable person, and you waited on people. This tells that story. And they filmed some of it in Winnipeg, and they used the steam engine called the Prairie Dog Central. And these guys were like, oh boy, we're going to be on TV. This is going to be great. We're going to be in, and literally they filmed the thing passing by for maybe 10 seconds. They sat there for 8 hours. Some days they didn't film anything. It was not glamorous. But yeah, to get that these days, they probably would do it with a computer generated thing. But certainly, when I got married, my brother was my best man. He read this speech that talked about our family history. And he said, when we were kids, our parents would take us on steam excursions behind steam engines. They would put us on the track in front of the train and take our pictures. The train wasn't moving. I thought that was a great line. in the waning days of steam, there was so much nostalgia. They would sell out trips from Montreal, Toronto, Hamilton. And people had such nostalgia about it that they would pay to ride. And, you know, it ended up being eventually insurance. There was a big thing too, because nobody wanted to, in case somebody stepped in front of the train, whatever. But what a change.
Well, Eric, I want to thank you for a talk that's obviously engaged our sense of national nostalgia. We think Canada, we think trains, that may be passing now, but it's deeply embedded in us, and you certainly convey that. And I want to thank you on behalf of the society.
Thank you very much.
Buy a book on trains. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us.